What's your internal process, how to find out what's actually legit and what's just a scam?
Most times when I see a claim, it's usually drastically overinterpreted. When something aligns with our personal bias, skepticism is very, very low. When something is opposition to our personal bias, our level of skepticism is very, very high. Date your hypothesis, don't marry it, because the divorce is a bitch.
Dr. Layne Norton, scientist, powerlifter, and one of the most outspoken evidence-based voices in fitness. Layne has built a career on brutal honesty, data, and discipline.
What would your advice be for somebody who just wants to get in shape?
Start now, imperfectly, and figure that shit out on the way. People, when they ask, how much can I absorb? They don't care about how much they can absorb. What they're really asking is, what do I get an anabolic benefit from?
Does it matter when you take it and how much can you actually absorb?
The anabolic window.
Today on HackU, we're joined by one of the most influential, respected voices in the world of nutrition and performance, Dr. Layne Norton. Layne is not only a PhD in nutritional sciences, but also a pro-natural bodybuilder, world champion powerlifter, and one of the most relentless mythbusters in the industry. He's built his reputation by cutting through noise with hard science, challenging misinformation, and helping people truly understand how metabolism, fat loss, muscle building actually work. Mike and I today spoke to Layne and opened up a lot of avenues how protein intake, muscle building, training regimen, sleep truly and really impacts your overall health.
Layne is somebody who I've wanted to speak to for a very long time. When I started getting into training, fitness, nutrition, he was one of the first people on the scene, and he's had a very well-respected reputation in this industry, and he's not afraid to give his opinion and get into arguments with some people online. But he's someone who we need to be listening to, because especially in today's day and age, there's a lot of misinformation which is spread on podcasts, and a lot of podcasts which have a very big audience. And, you know, you need people who actually know what they're talking about, that have read the studies or done the studies themselves, for them to actually weigh in what is true and what's not true. And Layne is one of those people.
Dr. Layne Norton, welcome to the HackU podcast.
Thanks for having me on, guys. I appreciate it.
When Mike and I launched the HackU, you were one of the people that we wanted to get on this platform, because you are evidence-based, no BS, no clickbait, but actually trying to share things that work for people to integrate in their daily lives, to make themselves healthier and a better version of themselves. So we're very, very excited to have you on.
Thanks. I'm excited to be on. I love being able to help people out and try to simplify some of this, some of the fire hose of information that's out there.
I actually listened to one of your podcasts where you discussed that the more podcasts out there, it's not always beneficial, because there's so many people, so many hoax out there that are selling something in their interest, or just something that seems like attractive right now. What's your internal process, how to find out what's actually legit and what's just a scam?
Yeah, I mean, you know, surface level, I haven't read every research study out there, obviously, right? Millions and millions of research studies. And so typically there's kind of a process I go through, which is, if I see a claim in the media or on social media, I joke with people, but typically the veracity of the claim is inversely proportional to the number of exclamation marks and the extreme, how extreme the claim is. Most times when I see a claim that I'm like, that seems weird, or that seems like crazy, when I go look up the actual research, it may be some elements of truth to it, but it's usually drastically overinterpreted and exaggerated. Sometimes it doesn't exist, and sometimes it's completely opposite of what the person says. I've had that multiple times as well. Now, I have the benefit of having done a research-based PhD where, I mean, literally, I was reading dozens of scientific papers every single week. And then having to go through the process of figuring out what questions I wanted to answer in my own research, and then coming up with research design to be able to actually answer the question that I wanted to answer. And I think that gave me and at the same time, I was also coaching people one-on-one online. I think and competing myself in bodybuilding, powerlifting. So I think that gave me kind of a unique nexus of intersection of understanding the science, but also what it means practically and how to apply it. Because you've got a lot of people who can understand scientific studies, but they can't necessarily relay that information to the average person. when I go into any topic, I will say I don't rely on AI to interpret things for me, but it is useful if I'm going into a subject that I know very little about. There's a tool I use called consensus.app, which is basically, think about like ChatGPT combined with PubMed. So if it asks you if you ask it a question, it'll give you kind of a quick consensus of the literature, and then you can filter results, by human studies, randomized control trials, different characteristics of studies, quality of study. So usually I kind of start there if I don't know really hardly anything about a topic, just to get the lay of the land. And then I'll start to go through, okay, what are the specific, what we call meta-analyses, say, on a topic, if they're available, which is meta-analyses are essentially studies of studies, where they take research studies that already exist that have similar designs and try to combine the results in order to come up with, okay, what does the overall effect look like? And so if that looks like it's pretty clear in one direction or another, then I can feel pretty good about the research. And then I'll start to read maybe some of the more well-known randomized control trials on a topic. But if there's like conflicting literature, or, it doesn't seem to be like a big effect, usually what I'll go to next is, okay, what are the randomized control trials say? What are the best, well-designed, tightly controlled ones say? And if those aren't in agreement, then I kind of go, we don't really have an answer yet. When it comes to specific claims about specific studies, obviously I go and read the study, and I'm a little bit different in how I approach that. The first thing I read is I just go straight to the results section. I read, okay, what did they find? Then I go to the methods section and go, how did they test it? And was their design actually set up to get the answer that they were to answer the question that they were asking? Because I can tell you that there's many times where I go to a methods section, I go, you actually didn't design this to get the answer for your question. You got data, but it's not a direct answer to your question. But most times, here's what tends to happen on social media. I can remember a couple specific claims that stand out in my mind. Robert Lustig was on Andrew Huberman's podcast, and Andrew's a friend of mine, and I like Andrew. And, as having my own podcast, I try to tell people, because people got mad at Andrew about this. I'm like, listen, you don't have, in real time, there's no way to fact check somebody that quickly. Like, you just can't do it. You can try to push back a little bit, but at the end of the day, if you're having somebody on your podcast and you're asking the questions, it's because you view them as a subject matter expert and you're kind of taking their word for it. And Lustig brought up a study that was, he said, was in Denmark or Copenhagen, and they had people either drink a liter of soda, a liter of diet soda, a liter of full fat milk, or a liter of water per day for 6 months. And it was in 100 people. Now, right away when I went to I found the study, because I had to go through like his blogs and stuff. I found it on one of his blogs, a link to it, or the name of it, found the study itself, got the full text, 47 people, not 100. It was for 6 months, and it was semi-skim milk, not full fat milk. But then when I got to the results, that's where things were really crazy. So he had claimed that the people that were doing regular soda gained 10 kilos in a month. And it was like, or 10 kilos in 6 months, and it was 1.5. And then he claimed that people on diet soda gained 2 kilos. No, they actually lost like 0.1, a non-significant amount, but 0.1 kilograms of fat. People who drank water, it was a neutral effect. There was not one way or the other. And people who drank, it was semi-skim milk, they had similar weight gain to the soda group. But they also had a little bit more lean mass. So it did look like there was a partitioning effect to that. But I'm like, man, like that is such a, he had claimed the soda group gained 10 kilos, the milk group lost 2 kilos, the water group, I think he said, lost 2 kilos, and the diet soda group gained 2 kilos. And I'm like, millions of people listen to this podcast. And my breakdown came out probably a month afterwards. And after a month, one person literally looked up this study. One, me. And then there was another time where, again, another guy like Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO, he had Dr. Tara Swart on, and she said resistance-trained men just thought about lifting weights and their muscles grew 13%. Went to the study. The only study I could find that had anything that was 13% was, it was a 12-week study, not 2 weeks. It was not resistance-trained men. It was an untrained men. And they had them think about either elbow flexion, which is bicep curls on one arm, or finger abduction. And they found that finger abduction strength increased by quite a bit just by thinking about it. Bicep curl strength increased by 13%. So there does appear to be like some effect. But that 13% increased strength on a bicep curl in untrained people is a far cry from, and in 12 weeks, is a far cry from 13% increase in muscle mass in 2 weeks in resistance-trained men. And so, it's, the biggest thing I tell people is like, listen, not everybody's equipped to read scientific studies. But the old adage, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
But why do you think people make claims like that? I mean, those are specialists. It's not like they're making benefits. It's not like they're selling semi-skimmed milk. Why would you go on a platform like this? Is it?
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is that people automatically go to money as a major driver as to why people make claims. I will tell you, supporting one's personal beliefs in some ways is a more powerful driver than income. I mean, just look at how passionate people get about politics. Those people, a lot of people online who are arguing with each other for hours aren't getting paid anything for arguing about politics. But you can make anything an identity. And in the case of someone like, let's take, for example, Lustig, you have really dug your heels on insulin, fructose. These are the causes of all the problems. And when you dig in that deep and you make it like an identity, it's hard to acknowledge data to the contrary, because then you are not just wrong. Your whole identity is a lie. That's the problem. Now, I will say, when it came to like the misrepresentation of these studies, I always say one of two things has to be true. They either didn't read it, or they read it, didn't care what it said, and made up something else. I guess there's a third in there, which is they did read it and then they forgot the details and then they, said something. But I will tell you, there's many times where I can't recall the specific details of a study. And here's what I'll say. I'll say, listen, I may butcher the details, but here is the general take on the study, right? But I'll paraphrase that and say, I'll even say sometimes, hey, in the comments, if you know this study and I screwed it up, please comment here, right? But I think a lot of times what happens is with, people like this, they hear it from somebody else who they trust or respect. They don't fact check it, and then they repeat it. And here's the problem I think it's just a human problem. We have a very asymmetrical level of criticism or critical thought. When something aligns with our personal bias, our level of skepticism is very, very low. When something is opposition to our personal bias, our level of skepticism is very, very high, right? Which is why I always tell, like, for example, carnivores, I'm like, if red meat had the data on it that fiber had for your overall health, you all would lose your absolute ever-loving minds if anybody suggested it wasn't the best health food on the planet, But again, it's asymmetrical application of skepticism. And we do that too, asymmetrical application of logic. There's a video, literally the title of the video from Paul Saladino says, "Why all epidemiology is garbage." And then Paul's on the Joe Rogan podcast citing multiple epidemiological studies that just happen to align with his bias. So what you're really saying is the studies I don't agree with are garbage, but the ones that I do agree with are beyond reproach. And that unfortunately is what, as somebody who's kind of agnostic, that's what you deal with, is you deal with people who won't be willing to apply skepticism across the board.
Is there anything in particular that you have found over the past couple of years that was particularly hard to change your mind upon? Something that you were so firmly believing in, but new data came out and you were kind of forced to change your beliefs on it?
So my PhD advisor, Don Layman, he had a great line, and he said, "Date your hypothesis, don't marry it, because the divorce is a bitch." And I don't feel like I can say it now because it's not, I might get canceled, but there's a line from a Tupac song, I think it is, where it's like, don't make a housewife,
Yeah.
So,
We know this song.
Date your hypothesis, but don't make that a housewife,
Yeah.
And the reality is the point of that is, if you are so married to something, if you are so locked into it, it is really hard to change a belief system. But if you just view it as, this is just information, and try to peel back, and that's why, like, if you go to my Instagram bio, you don't see flexible dieting guru or IFYM or the protein guy or anything like that, because I don't want to tie my wagon to any one thing, because I don't think any data is going to come out that's going to drastically change my positions on anything out there, but it might, and I have to hold that open. And as a scientist, I've just been wrong so many times, especially in grad school, about things that I believed, that I just got okay with being wrong. And I had a PhD advisor who said all the time, "Hey, I'm okay with being wrong." So there are a few things I've changed my mind on. Like I had, so my research was in protein metabolism, specifically looking at the effect of branched chain amino acids, leucine, on muscle protein synthesis in muscle. And I used to recommend people to take branched chain amino acids, I said, they increase muscle protein synthesis, et cetera, et cetera. And I held on to that for a long time. And data started coming out showing, it doesn't seem to increase muscle mass, even if you take BCAAs. And still, I was like, I kind of came up with scenarios where I'm like, I still think it could matter in this scenario or that scenario. And I remember reading something from somebody one time that was about a different topic, but it said, if your hypothesis requires such rigid things to be true, if it requires such a tight window of testing to be true, it's probably not a very robust hypothesis. And I was like, God damn, that's true. Because, like, let's take for example a supplement we know works, creatine monohydrate. It works. It's not like, okay, it just works in this specific population or in these specific. No, it's, you have some isolated studies here and there that show no effect, but overall, the vast majority of the studies across decades of research, thousands of studies, tens of thousands of subjects in multiple countries, laboratories, across different kinds of funding sources, all the data points the same way, right? That is a robust hypothesis. That is a robust finding. So anyways, I even sold my first supplement company, which was a partnership between myself and bodybuilding.com, which was called Carbon Supplements. We had a BCA product, a BCA-based product. This is back in 2015, 16, 17. And then when I started Outwork in 2020, I was like, can't make a BCA product. I can't justify it based on the evidence. So, I mean, here was something I made money on, and I changed my mind on it, and even had people saying, where's the BCA product? And had to go, yeah, looks like I had that one wrong. And had people like, you scammed us. I'm like, oh, I just, I changed my thinking. Another one would be, LDL cholesterol. When I got into graduate school, I was very much in the camp, and I was in a low carb lab. And even now, I love my PhD advisor. We would probably disagree on some of the specifics around this. I thought it's not about LDL. I think the risks around saturated fat are overblown. It's really about the HDL to LDL ratio. And then they started coming out with what are called Mendelian randomized trials. And I don't want to bore people with details, but one of the challenges in nutritional research is you can't do really long controlled trials, because who wants to have their lives controlled for 10, 20, 30 years? It's hard to do. I think the longest randomized control trials you really see in nutrition research are like 2 years. I mean, that's a really long trial. And usually that's still a pretty like loose control trial. What Mendelian randomization does is it takes advantage of the fact that we have natural gene mutations and polymorphisms on genes that change metabolism in certain areas, right? And so in the case of LDL cholesterol, we have people who, based on gene mutations or certain gene polymorphisms, secrete more or less LDL cholesterol, or they clear more or less LDL cholesterol, or the metabolism of one form to LDL cholesterol is a different rate, right? There's probably over a dozen genes that are responsible for this. And since genes are randomly assigned, like you don't get to choose the genes that you get, we can assume that since it's random, that any difference between groups based on those random gene assignments are due to whatever we're looking at. Does that make sense? Because when we think about randomized control trials, it's important to point out the randomization is very important. The reason being, okay, let's say you guys are going to go do a trial, right? And we say, let's say it's a diet on high protein diets versus low protein diets. And I say, Mike, Adam, you guys are going in the low protein group. What do you got? You guys are probably going to be like, bye, see ya. I don't want to be in the trial anymore. Right? So they don't let people self-select in these trials, because if you were to self-select, you guys would both pick, I'm guessing, high protein. Absolutely. But the problem is you probably also lift weights and you live a healthier overall lifestyle. And so there's confounding variables in there that you wouldn't be able to say, oh, it's just due to the protein. And this is some of the problems with observational research, right? Because if you're just observing, people who have health promoting characteristics tend to have other health promoting characteristics. So the randomization is important, because if we take people and we go, again, assuming you can't pull out the study, but we go, okay, you're going to this group, you're going to that group, and it's just random, right? We can assume that any inherent differences in characteristics amongst the subjects are randomly distributed over those groups. And therefore, if there's a difference between the groups, we can assume it's due to the treatment and not different inherent characteristics. Does that make sense? So with Mendelian randomization, we're essentially doing the same thing, but just with genes that control this stuff, okay? And when you look at the Mendelian randomization studies, which are able to, the benefit to these is they can look at your lifelong LDL exposure, right? Not just over the course of a few years. Because heart disease doesn't develop over a few years. It's a decades-long thing. So the longest trials on heart disease, the control trials on heart disease, are like 5 years long. But if you're in your 40s or 50s, how many people are having significant cardiovascular events in a 5-year period? It's not going to be that many. And so you're going to have a really small number. And when you're comparing small numbers, it's hard to get differences. It's hard to see differences. And then if you do have differences, you don't know if it's real. Like there was one trial, for example, I'm thinking of a corn oil trial back in the 60s. So they had people either eat a normal amount of saturated fat or substitute with corn oil. And at the end of the study, the big takeaway was, there was a significant difference in the number of cardiovascular events, and it was worse in the corn oil group. The problem is, you know what the absolute number of events was? 9 versus 6. 2. Yeah. So do you really trust like 11 total data points? If they had done 1,000, it could have been flipped. So with Mendelian randomization, we have studies where we have hundreds of thousands of participants from these databanks looking at your entire lifelong exposure to LDL cholesterol. And when you look at that, regardless, here's the thing, it is regardless of what gene they look at. Straight line, like literally a straight line through your exposure to LDL and ApoB and your risk of a cardiovascular disease event. And what's really crazy is, I think what really flipped this for me was per like about 40 milligram per deciliter. So you guys are familiar with the units for LDL. So like they say, keep it under 100. Per 40 mil per deciliter reduction in LDL, there is a 50% reduction in risk of a cardiovascular event. Mm-hmm. And that dosage holds for any of the genes measured. So if this was just, because some people will say, well, there's the issue of pleiotropy, which is basically like, okay, well, if you modify this gene, maybe it modifies metabolism somewhere else. Okay, if that was true, we would expect that some of these trials with all these different genes, there'd be different outcomes, but it holds across all these genes. So when I saw all that, I was like, yeah, okay. It looks like I was wrong about LDL cholesterol.
So now, given the fact that you said that a lot of studies that don't have enough data, but creatine has probably the most research out there. And creatine has like this huge trend boom now where it's not just for men who are athletic or active, it's women for cognitive, it's even for children now. What is your stance, or what's the information say as of today for active men, active women, and when it comes to children, what's the age and dosage?
Okay, so this is one of those things where absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is we don't really have safety data in kids, direct safety data, because it's hard to get.
Everybody's asking me.
Yeah,
everybody's asking me. Should I give children? How much? How early?
Yeah, this is kind of like the Tylenol data in pregnancy. It's like you can't do a randomized control trial on pregnant women because how do you do that? You'd be like, okay, so ma'am, I would like your baby to be the test guinea pig here. You're getting either placebo or something that we think might give it autism. Enjoy the trial. Like, come on, you can't know. First off, every university and research place has what's called an internal review board, an IRB. And basically that board exists so that we don't have what happened in the 1950s where people were doing unethical trials on people, or like a classic trial would be like that would never get approved now, but gave us a lot of data, was the Minnesota starvation experiment, where they took conscientious objectors of World War II and literally starved them for 6 months, fed them 800 calories a day, and looked at what happened. You would never get that approved past an internal review board now. So when it comes to creatine in kids, it's the same issue. Like internal review boards are just, the liability is such a huge liability if something were to happen. And even if something, here's the problem with like supplements and like hormone replacement tends to be like this. You get a supplement and then you sneeze and you go, oh, it was the supplement that did it. Or, like anything. And that gets reported as an adverse event, even if it had nothing to do with the supplement, right? Or I used to joke like back, remember ephedrine? You guys remember that? Like back in the early 2000s, I used to joke that somebody in the FDA was like sitting in every NFL locker room waiting for somebody to keel over of heat stroke and put a bottle of ephedrine up in their locker, so they could ban it. Because
like BPC.
Yeah. So you could there's all these like case studies out there where somebody takes something and then something happens and they go to the doctor. You can write that up, but like that doesn't mean that X caused Y. You're inferring causation without a control. You can't do that. So the liability prevents direct research from being done. But here's what I feel comfortable saying. There was a recent meta-analysis published on creatine safety, and they looked at over 26,000 participants. And they found that they looked at over, I think, 40 reported side effects in these studies. And some of these studies were like, I think one study was 14 years long. Another study, which is probably most powerful, was 10 grams a day for 8 years. And what they found, the summation of it was there was no difference in the incidence of side effects reported in people taking creatine versus people taking placebo for any side effect. So, and they were looking at a lot of different groups, a lot of different types of people. Do I have any reason to believe that there would be something unique about children that would make creatine uniquely deleterious? I have no reason to think that. But I will never tell somebody, hey, you should have your kid take creatine. Now, I always answer questions, or I try to answer questions in two different ways, which is here's what the research says, and here's if you inject me with truth serum, what I think and what I do. My kids take creatine because I do believe it is very safe. There is a lot of emerging data on cognitive benefits, even recovery from traumatic brain injury benefits, and obviously the performance benefits that we know about. And like I have my kids lifting weights, because it's good for them. And we have no reason to believe that it'd be any different. Now, would I tell somebody out there you should put your kid on creatine? I'm not going to tell them that. But do I feel comfortable enough with the research literature that I can have my kids take creatine and it doesn't keep me up at night? Yes.
That makes sense. Moving on to protein requirements, because this one always gets a lot of attention. And to be honest, this is something which I've changed my mind on since I started lifting, or at least getting into tracking my macros and actually trying to hit targets. I think back in the day, I always used to try and aim for 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And then since that, it has dropped down since I've been listening to other people like yourselves that I respect. Menno Henselmans, I think he recommends that anything beyond 1.7 isn't really going to provide you with much of a difference. I think you yourself have said 1.6. Obviously, it really depends upon the individual, because there's somebody who may just want to work out a little bit and just look good. Whereas you get people who are on the extreme ends of the spectrum, like myself, who would like to be as jacked as possible. So I am not going to be stressing out if I get a little bit more than I need. I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So what would your advice be for somebody who just wants to get in shape and just build some muscle, build some strength and look good, versus somebody who is like, I want to be as jacked as possible?
Mike, you are asking the question the correct way to get the correct answer. So you already have done the first step of a good scientist, to ask the right question. Because I get a lot of people who will ask me about protein, and it's like, well, what are your goals? And they can't even really tell me like what it is. Like, it's like most people don't want to be the like most jacked person they possibly can be. Most people are just like, I just want to look good and build some muscle, but they get worried about the margins of like these marginal differences that don't really matter, especially when they're usually not consistent anyway. So you're asking the question, you're framing it the right way. So I'm going to give you the three answers that I usually give, which is, here's what the research says. Here's what I think. You inject me with true serum, and here's what I do. So research-wise, there absolutely does appear to be kind of I don't want to call it a capping out, and I'll explain why later, but you get the vast majority of the benefits for protein at around that 1.6 grams per kilogram number. And then people will get, they'll like, well, is that per lean mass or is that per body weight? And it's like, okay, so that's based on body weight. But obviously, if you're somebody who is very obese, you do not need 1.6 grams per kilogram of all your mass. So what I tell people is, if you're worried about it, do it per kilogram of ideal body weight, or whatever you want to do. Like, again, we're arguing, we're really down in on the blades of grass right now. You know what I mean? Like most people, I'm like, stop eating like crap and just, get at least 3 meals with high quality protein. That's a good start, right? Like you're worried about stuff that you're not even doing right now. And I think a lot of that too is people, they like getting caught in the weeds, because then it gives them an excuse not to start doing stuff because, I don't have it perfectly lined up, I can't start now. And it's like, no, start now imperfectly and figure that shit out on the way. Because if you're not willing to start now, you're just not willing to do it, period. So yeah, around 1.6, somewhere in that area, we get the vast majority of the benefits of protein. Now, I will tell you, there are some what are called meta-regressions, which is basically you're trying to project out a dose response of whatever you're looking at. And these meta-regressions, one of them did show kind of what they called a dose response of protein up to like 3.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, when people hear dose response, I want to be very clear, that doesn't mean a one-to-one relationship. It doesn't mean, okay, I eat X number more grams of protein, I get this much more lean mass. It simply means if you eat more, you get more. But it doesn't say anything about how big the benefit is. Does that make sense? So I'll give a parallel that I think fits, which is volume, resistance training volume, number of hard sets. There's a dose response between number of hard sets and hypertrophy. But you get the vast majority of the benefits in the first 5 to 10 sets on a body part per week. Like that is, you're getting, again, I don't want to put hard numbers on it, but you're getting the majority of the benefits right there. Now, if you add more, you can still get more hypertrophy, but the gains become less and less per set. Does that make sense? To the point where when you're far enough out, the gains pretty much become imperceptible. It's kind of what we call an asymptote, where you don't think of like a linear response. You think of in the front end of the curve, it's pretty steep, and then it starts to flatten out. You're still getting a response, but it gets less and less the more of the dose you put in. I think protein...
Layne, is the response depending on the source of the protein also?
Let me answer this question.
How well you absorb it.
Yeah, let me answer this question and then ask me that one again. I'll come back to it in case I forget. So I think protein is the same way. I think that if you eat more, you do get a dose response. But I just think that at a certain point, the gains are going to be imperceptible. Like it's just going to be where you're not going to see any real difference. Maybe if you did it for 25 years, you might see like a small difference in lean mass. But like I said, it'll be impossible to pick out in a research study because these research studies are 8-12 weeks and they're in, dozens of people. And I know enough about how muscle mass and lean mass is measured. Like we just don't have the type of instrumentation and sensitivity to pick out those differences. So that is what I really think. Here's what I do. I eat about 2.5 grams per kilogram body weight. That's more than what people would say I quote unquote need. But I kind of am in your camp, Mike, which is it's not hurting me. And if it gets me a little bit extra benefit, I am interested in being the most jacked, strongest person I can be. And so I don't mind if I'm quote unquote wasting some protein. That doesn't bother me. But if I hated protein, and the other thing is I have a bias towards protein. I did a PhD in protein, and I grew up in the era of Flex magazine back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I just am used to eating a lot of protein. And so it's just become habit for me. And so I would never tell anybody you need to eat this much protein to gain muscle. You can absolutely gain muscle at that 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight and probably get most of the benefits. What I tell people is, hey, if you're just looking to build some muscle and you don't like protein, hey, you can build plenty of muscle on 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight. The biggest lever you have for building muscle is resistance training. It's so much more important than the amount of protein you take in. So much more important. That is the biggest lever by far. If you're worrying about protein, but you're not training hard, you're stepping over dollars to pick up pennies. And I say that as somebody who has a PhD in nutrition and loves protein, right? So yeah, I consume about 2.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And I feel comfortable saying that I don't think there's any real negative effects to that. And I feel like I'm covering my bases where I'm getting, at least 99% of the benefits of protein.
So the question is the 2.5 grams, can somebody say, I take that from protein shake or I get whole foods? And if it's whole foods, would it require less to get the same effect?
So I just had an interesting conversation with, what's his last name? Gosh, it's going to kill me now. Nick Bird at University of Illinois, my alma mater. He's a professor there now. He came out of, he was a PhD student in Stuart Phillips' lab, and Stu Phillips is currently the world's leading expert in protein metabolism. So Nick came from a great lab, and he's at a great place to study protein metabolism at Illinois. And they have some interesting research. He did a study. Let me go back before I get in the weeds. If you eat enough total protein, at the level of protein I'm eating, the source is of minimal importance. You at a certain point, the signal is so saturated, the source doesn't matter. My PhD research did show that at like lower or modest protein intakes, that the source becomes a lot more important. So for example, if you're eating like 10 or 20 grams at a meal of protein, then if you have something like whey, it's going to be a pretty big difference in the anabolic response compared to something like wheat. Okay, wheat gluten or some of those poor quality proteins. But if you get both at like 40 grams, you just got enough of the anabolic stimulus that it's going to have the same effect. So I would say if you're somebody who's on the lower end of protein intake, you're down around that 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, then yeah, maybe you need to pay a little bit more attention to the source. But if you're getting enough total, doesn't seem to matter. Now, that being said, Nick's research is pretty interesting. So they did one study where they gave egg white protein versus whole egg protein. And they looked at same total protein, and they looked at protein synthesis. And actually, the whole egg was better, which was very surprising to me because my research kind of showed that the response is based on the leucine content of the protein sources. And both of those protein sources have the same leucine content. So when this first happened, I kind of looked at it and I'm like, it's one study. It could just be an anomaly. And then they did a study looking at like salmon, whole salmon, versus basically trying to replicate salmon with the same amino acid, like protein amino acid mixture and fat mixture, and they still found the same thing. So that's kind of interesting. And then they did a recent study on pork. So they did ground pork, and they did lean versus fatty pork. And they thought they were going to see higher rates of muscle protein synthesis with the fatty pork based on what they had observed previously. And they actually got the opposite result. But Nick's, we chatted back and forth about this, and he said, we both kind of were like, it looks like the food matrix may make a difference. We don't know exactly what's causing that. But the end output is, if you eat enough total protein, none of it really matters that much. But I will say, I'm always going to encourage whole food consumption for sure. But I think whey protein, or some protein powders, they're great for people who have trouble getting their protein in. But you don't need whey protein. I mean, I sell whey protein. It's sitting right over there. But I would never tell somebody, hey, you need to take this, or it's more anabolic than I'm not going to say that. Like if you want to eat it all from whole foods, you can do just fine. But again, for a lot of people, trying to get in, 1.6, 2 grams per kilogram body weight is a lot of protein, and they benefit from having some protein shakes. So why would we take that tool away from them? And we do know, like, especially with whey, it is a very high quality protein. Very absorbable, great amino acid profile, great digestibility. So, and then even things like protein bars, like I argue with this all the time because people hear ultra processed food. They just think all ultra processed food bad. Well, whey is ultra processed and it's a health food. I'm sorry. Like it lowers inflammation. It improves insulin sensitivity. It improves body composition. How is that not a health food? I don't care how much it's processed. We should be looking at the outcomes, not just lumping everything into one thing. And so then with protein bars, people kind of do the same thing. And again, conflict of interest. I'm an investor in David Protein. They've had some criticisms. But I tell people, I'm like, hey, no one is like, I'm not, and no one I've seen is saying, hey, no, don't eat that chicken, rice, and broccoli or that whole food protein source. Eat a David bar instead. Nobody's saying that. What we're saying is like, hey, this is a convenient, high quality protein source at a reasonable price point. And it is a lot of protein per calorie. It is the highest protein per calorie of any bar by far. That's all we're saying. You don't need it. If you want to get all from whole food, absolutely, you can do that. But again, like the idea that, it's ultra processed, automatically bad. I mean, I just interviewed a guy named Samuel Dickin on my podcast, and he just put out a very well done study on ultra processed foods versus minimally processed foods. And the hypothesis people had was, the ultra processed group is going to gain weight, right? And he had people either on minimally processed diets or ultra processed diets for 8 weeks. But the caveat was the ultra processed diet met all the nutritional requirements. So they got all their vitamins and minerals and enough fiber and enough protein. And those people actually lost a little bit of weight. They didn't lose as much as the minimally processed group because they still ate more calories, but they actually lost a little bit of weight. So obviously all ultra processed food is not created equally. If you get something like a protein bar, sure, it's ultra processed, but I don't know anybody who's like, man, I got gained so much. I just couldn't stop eating protein bars, like I was addicted to them. Like if you eat like 1 or 2 protein bars, you're like, yeah, I'm good. So we got to stop lumping everything so broadly,
Would you say that we should pay any attention to the ratios of the carbs and the fats in each meal that we have? Because I remember the back of the day when I used to start, tracking everything, I was like, okay, I'm going to have my protein, but with this meal, it's going to be predominantly carbs. And then if I'm going to have like fats with this meal, then I'm going to reduce the carbs. I did it for a long time, and with a lot of trial and error and checking how I responded, to be honest, I didn't really see much of a difference. I think maybe I've competed twice before and I was getting into like body fat percentages in single digits. Maybe it had a little bit more of an effect then, but I think generally speaking, I think overall calorie intake is the most important thing that you should be taking into consideration. Would it be right in saying that?
You are right, and you're gonna laugh. I did the same thing when I was in college. I tried it out. I think it was John Berardi who suggested it. I like John. John and I have a good relationship. And again, like people get things wrong. The thought behind it was, well, it's not carbs or fats that are bad. It's when they're in combination. You have a high insulin with high amounts of free fat, high amounts of fat in the bloodstream. That insulin is driving that fat into adipose, right? The problem is you're looking at like a section in time and you're trying to equate long-term outcomes. And there's a couple holes in the thinking. The first one is dietary fat doesn't need insulin to be stored. It can be stored just fine in absence of rises in insulin. There's a protein called, acylating protein. I think it's just called acylating protein. ACP, I want to say, not 45 ACP for my gun advocates. And that will basically, even in the absence of a rise in insulin, will still allow you to store dietary fat in adipose. So you don't need insulin. And if you're just having carbs at a meal, maybe you're not storing as much fat from the meal you just ate because you don't have any dietary fat. And we do know that based on metabolic tracer studies, so a metabolic tracer basically is you can label like carbohydrates, fats, proteins with what's like a heavy isotope that you can basically see where it goes. You can track it where it goes, what tissues it winds up in, right? And we know from these studies that over 98% of the fats that wind up in adipose originate as dietary fat. Less than 2% come from carbohydrate. So people will look at that, and that's where this kind of thinking comes from, I think, Mike, is, okay, well, if we keep carbs and fats separate, carbs don't get stored as body fat, right? That's relatively true. But let's say we just have a carb-heavy meal. While you're not storing a bunch of fat at that meal, you're also inhibiting the release of fatty acids from fat cells too, right? And then later, when you eat dietary fat, it can still be stored anyway. Now, at the end of the day, it matters your total calories in, calories out, because here's the thing that both high fat, low carb, and low fat, high carb people get wrong. It's not about the storage of fat or the burning of fat. It's about the balance of each. So you have what's called fat balance, which is basically if you visualize a fat cell, an adipocyte, there's always fat fluxing out and fluxing in. Okay. Now, if you eat, say, a low carb, high fat diet, you will burn a lot of fat, right? Because your insulin's low. So you have a lot of fat fluxing out. You're going to burn a lot of fat. But you're eating high fat, so you're also storing a lot of fat. So a lot of fat is fluxing in as well. If you have low fat, high carb, you're not burning much fat, so not much is fluxing out, but you're also not storing much fat, right? So not much is fluxing in. What ends up determining whether you actually gain or lose body fat is whether or not you're consuming excess calories or not. That still ends up being, and we have, the best study on this was a meta-analysis of 20 controlled feeding trials where they equated calories and protein, which is important because protein is thermogenic. They equated calories and protein They provided all the meals to participants, or it was in a metabolic ward, so it was very highly controlled. And the summation of those studies was basically there was no difference in fat loss between any amount of carbohydrate or fat exchange. So all that to say, Mike, I still kind of skew my carbs and fats a little bit. I have more carbs and a little bit lower fat before I train and after I train. But most of that is just my bias from growing up in the Flex magazine days and hearing that was how I was supposed to eat. So I started eating that way, and then it just became a habit, right? But I don't think it's necessarily superior. I do think if you're going to have a high fat meal before you go in and train, sometimes it can make you feel a little like upset your GI a bit. So I do caution people against having like too much fat before a workout for those reasons. But I don't think there's like any metabolic advantage either way. I think carbs and fats should kind of be viewed as like just energy filler in some ways.
Yeah. When I used to coach my clients back in the day, I would just tell them to try it out. So try a high carb meal, low fat before workout. Do the workout. See how you feel. How was your performance? And then do the opposite. High fat, low carb. Do the workout. See how you feel. And then based upon which allowed you to optimize your session, then stick with that. The same thing in an evening. Like for me personally, I always just like to look forward to consuming a load of carbs near to bedtime because it just like kind of relaxes me and chills me out a little bit. So I always say to people, there is no necessarily right or wrong way. Just try it, reflect, see how you feel.
Well, and Mike, what you're talking about, personal preference, that is so, nobody talks about it because it's not sexy, but if people just leaned into personal preference, they could have such better results. And I'll give you several examples of that. I could sit here and say, you know what? There's no evidence that having these carbs, that much carbs for a workout or lowering fat or doing this, it won't make a difference because in the research data, there's no difference, right? But it doesn't matter. You're not an average. You are an individual person. And who gives a shit if there's data or not? If you know, hey, I just feel better doing it this way and I like it better, that is a completely reasonable reason to do it. It's just, what I tell people is just be honest about why you're doing it. Like, don't try to do like scientific fuckery to like make it seem superior to any other way. But like, if you like it, like I do stuff that I can't cite a PubMed citation for, you know, but I just like it. I do the same thing. I tend to eat a little bit more in the evening because I like it.
So when speaking about food timing, when we started off the conversations about what new research came out and what changed your mind upon, the two things that I kind of impacted my life a little bit. When I grew up and I played D1 back in the day, we were told, hey, you have an anabolic window after workout. Make sure you get your protein in, right? 60 minutes after your workout.
Sure.
And then it said, but hey, there's no point in getting more than 25, 30 grams of protein because you can't absorb more. The research is now, I hear stuff, hey, you could take up 100 grams. It's actually more efficient to absorb. And there's an anabolic window. As long as you take it in the 24-hour span, you'll be completely fine. Can you really help the audience out? Does it matter when you take it? And how much can you actually absorb?
So if you're getting a high quality source, you're going to absorb most of it. And absorption, we have to define what absorption is. So this is, Mike, to the point earlier, to get the right answer, you have to ask the right question. And most people, when they ask, how much can I absorb? That's actually, they don't care about how much they can absorb. What they're really asking is, what do I get an anabolic benefit from? That is really what they're asking. Or where do the benefits cap out? That's really what they're asking. So, because absorption-wise, literally, absorption just refers to, okay, you eat food, it goes through your esophagus, into your stomach, into your duodenum of your small intestine, and then it begins being absorbed across the intestinal lumen. And it winds up, at least in the case of protein and amino acids, winds up in the portal vein of the liver. And then once it goes to the liver, whatever gets through the liver goes to the bloodstream. That's absorption. If it gets across the intestine into the portal vein of the liver, it's absorbed. Most protein sources, other than like intact plant sources of protein, some of those are poorly absorbed because the protein in the plant is bound up in the fibrous material of the plant. But if you're looking at things like whey protein, it's almost 100% absorbed. It doesn't matter how much you take in because what the body will do is just kind of slow down digestion to the rate that it can accommodate. to absorb these amino acids, but you're going to absorb all of it, or virtually all of it. You'll have a little bit of waste. So you absorb most of it. Now, what is beneficial for anabolism, it just so happens that, when it comes to like high quality protein sources like whey, we see that at least the effects of short-term increases in muscle protein synthesis look like they cap out around 20 or 30 grams. So in practical reality, the bros were right, but they were wrong about why they were right, if that makes sense, right? And then when it comes to the anabolic window, I mean, that was kind of a concoction by protein companies to get you to buy more whey protein, is really what it was. But I do kind of understand a little bit when you looked at some of the old research on particularly endurance exercise and muscle protein synthesis. What they saw is, and my PhD advisor, I believe, was the first person to show this, is when you do endurance exercise, muscle protein synthesis goes down and it does not recover until you have a meal with sufficient protein in it. And so I think that's kind of where the anabolic window came from. Now, resistance training is different. Resistance training does increase muscle protein synthesis. It just also increases muscle protein degradation in concert. And you don't really become net anabolic until you have protein. But the reality is, you probably ate protein. Like if you're a bodybuilder or a lifter or whatever, like most of them aren't going 8-10 hours without eating protein, right? So those amino acids from your last meal are still around. So they're still doing their job. Here's what I tell people. The anabolic window, I like what Alan Aragon says. It's probably more like a barn door. Okay. That's what the research says. The research says the timing doesn't really matter that much. Here's what I do and what I think. I think having protein after a workout is a good idea. I think having protein before a workout is a good idea, but you don't have to be too rigid with your timing. If I'm going to go in to train, usually I'll eat an hour or two before I go in to train, right? And then my training sessions are about 2 hours, and then I usually eat within an hour or two of finishing. So I'm hitting those windows, but in reality, that is like I eat lunch, I go into train, and then I come home and it's about time for dinner. So my training just naturally falls in like between two of those windows. And that's what I tell people to do. The one caveat would be like, if you're training fasted in the morning, that possibly may not be as good as, having a meal beforehand. And so I tell people, first off, most people who train fasted, if they're doing it for like extra benefits, I'll tell them, I'm like, you're not really getting any extra benefit to training fasted. You'll burn more fat during your workout. But the research shows that people who do exercise fasted versus fed, if they eat the same amount of calories per day, they lose the same amount of body fat, or the body composition changes are the same. But you may be having some slight impeding of anabolism because after an overnight fast, muscle protein synthesis is depressed. And now you're going in and doing a training session with it already depressed. So I will say to people, like, all right, if you just don't like working out with a lot of stuff on your stomach, then you could have like a whey protein shake and go in and train. Or like just have a smoothie, like take whey protein, put a banana in it, whatever, like blend it up. It's pretty easy for most people to tolerate. If you absolutely cannot tolerate anything like that, then you could do like an essential amino acid mixture or something of that nature. Just put yourself in a positive anabolic state. If being muscular is something that's important to you.
Would you recommend people have a target frequency of meals per day? I mean, obviously this is going to be very dependent on the calorie target and the protein target. I mean, for me, myself, whenever especially when I'm traveling, I'm on the move, and I only find the time or have access to food like 3 times per day, I notice it's quite obvious that I struggle to hit my protein target. Mm-hmm. My protein target of around like 200 grams or whatever it might be.
Sure.
Splitting that into 3 meals. Yeah. It's much easier for me to do that over 4. 4 is probably the average number of times I would eat per day. Now, there might be somebody who is, maybe they need to eat between 2,000, 2,500 calories per day. And they're like, do you know what? I just don't really like to eat. I prefer to just have like one meal, one big meal, and I'm going to have all those calories in one go. Would you say to those people, it's probably not going to be a good thing for you to do that if you're trying to actually put on some size and build muscle? And if they are, would you say there's a minimum number of times per day they would need to eat? I guess you've mentioned before that the pre-workout meal is important, the post-workout meal is important, and then, you could have another one after that or before that, depending upon what time you train.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to give you the 3 answers on this one. So the research science says that by far the most important thing is your total daily protein intake, by far. Amongst the human studies, there's some disagreement over whether protein distribution matters. Some studies say yes, some studies say no. Particularly, it does appear that breakfast may be unique amongst the distribution data, meaning if you look at people who get a high protein breakfast versus a low protein breakfast, you do tend to see a little bit more consistent results in terms of lean mass. But, this was one of the things I had difficulty reconciling, because if you think about muscle protein synthesis, okay, you get, depending on protein source, you're capping out muscle protein synthesis around 30 grams at a meal, maybe 40 or 50 if it's a low quality protein source. Okay. Well, then if that maxes it, how many times can you stimulate it? Right? And how long do you have to wait to re-stimulate it? And I don't want to get into the weeds on this one, but I did a research study that one of the coolest parts of my PhD is it changed the way I ate. I used to eat 8 meals a day, like try to get that IV drip of, amino acids was the idea, just keep them chronically elevated. And I got the results back from my first study and I was like, oh, maybe I was wrong about some of this stuff. And so I eat 4 meals per day now, sometimes 5 if it's a long day. And I'll explain. I don't want to get into the study because it would really go into the weeds, but I got just as good, if not maybe a little bit better results doing it that way. But coming back to the idea of, okay, you can only get so much protein synthesis at a meal, right? And there's no storage form of protein in the body. Your body can't really store amino acids. Now people will say, well, yeah, it can. It stores it in muscle. That's like saying a house is a storage form of wood. Like, yeah, you can get wood out of a wood house, but that's not why you built the house. Like, the purpose is not storage, So you have a small pool of amino acids. There's no real storage form. Carbohydrate, you have a decent storage form of glycogen. Fats, virtually unlimited adipose tissue. Protein, you don't really have. So it makes sense. You wouldn't be able to make up for low protein at some areas of the day by overeating at another meal, right? Like if you have 100 grams of protein in a meal, but you're capping out the anabolic response at 30 or 40, you're not making up for the rest of the day where you had no protein. And actually my last study I did in graduate school, and again, this is in rats. So I have to qualify that, but one of the benefits of animal studies, and I will say animal models, it's very dependent on the animal and what you're trying to study. So for example, pigs, dogs, really good models for human digestion, very similar digestive tracts. Rats, really good for protein metabolism. A lot of results transfer from rats to humans. So we did a study where we wanted to look at, okay, how much does this protein distribution story matter? So we had, and the other thing you can do with lab rats, it's great, is you can force them to follow whatever diet you want. and it doesn't matter. They can't complain about it. Oh, you don't like it? Here's your next meal. So I did a study where I did basically 3 meals that were evenly distributed in terms of their protein intake, a little bit more at dinner, but mostly even over 3 meals. And then another group where they were consuming 15% of their daily protein at breakfast and lunch, and then 70% at dinner, right? And we did that for 11 weeks. And I literally I formulated all these diets myself. This was over 100 rats, weighed out every single diet for every single rat for 11 weeks. I'm up at 5:30 in the morning weighing out all these diets. And again, the good part of that is 11 weeks of a rodent's life is years of a human's life. So we get to project a little bit more long-term of what could happen. So we got to the end of the study, we took out the hind limbs of these animals, and we found that yes, the rats that were eating a more even distribution had a little bit bigger muscles than the rats that were eating the uneven distribution. But it was like a 7% difference or 8% difference, I want to say, right? So pretty small difference. And this is literally like the most controlled experiment you can make it, right? So it doesn't surprise me that in like 8, 10, 12-week experiments in humans that they're not finding a ton of differences. So back to your original question, Mike. The research data says doesn't make much difference. Inject me with true serum, I say probably makes a little bit of difference and only something to really worry a lot about if you are interested in becoming the most muscular human being you can. And what I do is I eat about 4 to 5 meals per day. What I recommend to people is if you are interested in building muscle and it is a priority for you, 3 to 5 protein-rich, high-quality protein meals per day and getting enough total protein in, and you're covered.
Layne, from the audience perspective, the fact that you have access to so much research and did so much research is basically, their question is, what did you learn? So we talked about 4 to 5 meals, 3 to 5 meals, ideally 2.5 grams of protein. You work out 2 hours a day. But they're going to want to ask more. We know sleep is important, but the audience still is asking for that. What's the extra percentage? So in terms of your supplement stack or additional stack and all the secret stuff, what's the secret sauce that you've added over time to your daily habits to be the most muscular version of yourself?
It's gonna be very boring. I take creatine monohydrate. I mean, if I had a Mount Rushmore of supplements, it's going to be creatine, whey protein, and caffeine. So I'm not going to.
How much?
What's that?
The question is how much. That's everybody's.
Creatine 5 to 10 grams a day. Whey protein, consume sufficient amount to meet your daily protein needs, and caffeine. I mean, I am now more on the strength side of things. I compete in powerlifting. I haven't competed in bodybuilding in a long time. Obviously, having more muscle mass is good for powerlifting too. But on the strength side, you see benefits from caffeine around 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So a pretty high caffeine dose. I'm usually taking in like 300 to 500 before I work out. So
it's only beneficial before workout, or is there any benefits afterwards also?
I mean, I don't see why you would take it afterwards. You burn, it raises your metabolic rate a little bit, like 50 calories over a couple hours, or 50 calories over like 6 hours, I think it is. But I mean, who cares? That's not a whole lot. And then so that's like my Mount Rushmore. That's like tier 1, and then tier 2, would be things I've got in my supplement line. Like, in my recovery product, we have ashwagandha. I'm pretty bullish on ashwagandha. There's quite a bit of data now that shows it increases lean mass. I think my one area of skepticism with it is I don't feel like we've really fleshed out the mechanism of how it works. They've said, well, it increases testosterone. Yeah, like by 15%. That's not enough. Like that's great to know, but 15% increase in testosterone is not going to increase your muscle mass. It lowers cortisol, but it is an adaptogen. It's anti-inflammatory. It helps with sleep. So maybe there's some mechanism we're not sure of yet, or maybe it's just a combination, a synergistic effect of all those little things kind of adding up. So I like ashwagandha.
But would you do it in the morning or before bed?
Usually I do it after my workout. I'm not convinced that timing really matters, but I usually do it after my workout. And then things like, you're getting into the tier 2, you have things like for performance, citrulline malate or beta-alanine, some of these buffering agents that may help with, helping you push a little bit harder, longer. Recovery-wise, things like tart cherry, L-carnitine, L-tartrate, those can reduce delayed onset muscle soreness, can improve recovery time. Melatonin. Melatonin is actually a pretty decent anabolic agent. There's research actually showing it increases lean mass now. And it seems to do it. The obvious explanation is, well, people sleep better and so they get more lean mass.
Growth
but
hormone release. Yeah.
Seems like it may have an additional benefit beyond that. We're not exactly sure how. People have said, well, it increases growth hormone, but we also know pretty clearly growth hormone's not anabolic. Certainly not in the physiological dose. And even this always pisses bodybuilders off when I say this, but like even studies where they have people injected with growth hormone, there's no studies that I'm aware of that show increases in skeletal muscle mass. They show increases in lean mass, but it's from body water and connective tissue, not skeletal muscle. So, which may be a benefit, but yeah. So I don't know how to fully explain the melatonin story, but it seems to have some benefits as well. So those are some of the supplements I use on a daily basis. But really, what made biggest difference for me, especially performance wise, is my habits. Trying to get more sleep. And I think people overblow sleep. And I think the anxiety around sleep a lot of times causes more problems than the lack of sleep itself. Sometimes I'll sleep 6 hours, I'll wake up and I'll feel fine. And it'd be easy for me to go, oh man, I only slept 6 hours. And guess what? You get in that negative mindset and now it negatively affects your workout because you're having your no-see mode. I've gotten much better about just like being like, maybe it'll be good, maybe it'll be bad. We'll see how it goes. Just take it as it comes.
That's what you say always when you have bad sleep and you see the data.
Yeah, because obviously I'm wearing a Whoop and it's very easy to just look at it. And if your recovery is not what you would like it to be, or, you've underslept, that can get into your own head. And then you're thinking, well, I was kind of planning on hitting that PB today, but maybe I'll hold back and try it another day. And to be honest, because the majority of the time I'm sleeping good. So I do the most demanding sessions after the nights that I've slept best. And if I've had a bad sleep and I'm supposed to train, then I'm like, well, let's just move things around a little bit. I'm still going to work out and I'm going to do something, but I'm not going to try and do the most demanding session of the week after the night that I've had the worst sleep.
So I always recommend that people auto-regulate. But what I would say is, if you didn't have good sleep, doesn't mean you need to move your session. You can go in, start warming up, see how you feel, see how the weights are moving. If it feels, I always say I'm looking at multiple data points, right? If I wake up, I didn't get as much sleep, but I feel okay, feel pretty normal, and then I go in and weights are feeling like they're moving normal, I'll probably continue with my normal session. Because sleep, it's way less about what you got the night before and more about what has it been like the last few weeks. What has your overall recovery looked like the last few weeks? Because I will tell you, if you're sleeping pretty well and you have one night where you get 3 or 4 hours of sleep, probably won't negatively affect your performance that badly. If you've been sleeping 3-4 hours a night consistently and then you get a night of 9 hours, I would tell you your performance is still going to suck pretty bad. Because it's more about what you're doing over the course of time, right? And one of the things I caution people with these kinds of devices is just don't let the tail wag the dog, right? Because exactly what we talked about. First off, you're trusting that this is giving you accurate data, right? And I will tell you that some of the data on these wrist-worn devices is pretty underwhelming. They're pretty good for certain things. Steps, heart rate, that stuff seems to be very, very accurate. I'm not sure about heart rate variability, and there's also disagreements about how much that actually predicts recovery. But what they've basically shown in research studies is the best predictor of how quality your sleep was is literally your subjective, how do you feel that morning? That is the highest indicator of how good your sleep was. So, like I said, I've had nights where I sleep, or I think I sleep 8 hours and I wake up and I feel kind of trash. I've had other nights where I sleep 6 hours. I mean, this happened earlier this week. I slept 6 hours, just under. And I was like, I still feel okay. Went in and performed pretty well, my best ever squat session, literally my best 10 rep squat in the history of my lifting, 535 pounds for 10 reps. And it came after a day of travel out to Las Vegas, and I did not sleep at all the night before, like literally no sleep. So now would I say that that's like a normal thing to expect? Of course not. Right. But I took the same approach. I'm like, well, maybe it'll suck, but let's just get in there, start warming up and see how it goes. And if I need to back off, I'll back off. Right. And now I also use like a velocity device in my training where I can measure bar speed. So I know like when I'm warming up what my bar speed should mostly look like. But I can tell you, like, after using it for a while, I can do a rep and pretty much guess around what the bar speed was within like 10% of the actual speed. So my subjective, how I'm feeling warming up, I can usually get a good indication of like, okay, can I push on this session or do I need to back off? So what I'll tell people is sleep matters. But if you look at the data, I know 8 hours is like everyone gets hung up on 8 hours. But the research says that between 7 to 8, even 6.5 to 8 is kind of your sweet spot for overall health, mortality. And here's what's really weird. Yes, if you look at like curves of mortality, which is basically the risk of death over a certain time period, and you look at, sleep deprivation where you're getting, less than 7 hours. Per 1 hour reduction in sleep time from 7 hours down, you get a 5% increased risk in mortality. Per extra hour above 8, you get an 8% increase in mortality. Now, people will say, well, that's confounded because people who have depression or sick, they sleep longer, and so it's reverse causation. Okay, well, why can't we assume the same thing about people who are sleep deprived? What's to say that they're not sick with something? So I'm not saying that like sleeping too much is going to cause you to die early. I'm just saying that that sweet spot is probably closer to doable than a lot of people think. Because I think a lot of people are like, well, I can't get 8 hours, so I want, whatever. Hey, if you're getting 6 pretty consistently, you're still doing pretty okay, And a lot of it is individually dependent. I know for me personally, if I sleep consistently 6.5 to 7.5 hours a night, I feel great. And so if I don't sleep 8 hours, I don't get real bent out of shape about it. But sleep helps. Obviously, like, I don't think there's really a safe dosage of alcohol, but I do consume alcohol. I enjoy a good cigar and a bourbon, watching a sunset, a glass of red wine here and there, some craft beers, that sort of thing. But I realized like over time I had kind of gotten in too much of a habit of that, and peeling that back obviously helped because alcohol negatively impacts your sleep as well. And then honestly, one of the things that made the biggest difference for my training performance, pain, was psychological stress management. Like just not allowing myself to get so anxious and spun up about stuff. And that was probably the hardest thing to do. And man, I will tell you the quality of life you get from, I think a lot of people try to construct their lives to where they don't have stress. And I think that is the wrong approach because you are not in control of this big old nasty thing called the universe. And sometimes shit's just going to go sideways. Doesn't matter how many safeguards you put in place. Now, obviously, if you live a very chaotic lifestyle, you're using drugs, you're partying a lot or whatever, yeah, you can have higher stress and all that kind of stuff. But you can have the most zen setup, tons of money, and you are still going to get exposed to stress. You got to learn how to manage it. That's the biggest thing. And like learning how to talk to myself, and I ain't perfect with it. I'll be the first to admit I am not perfect with it, but learning how to just not go fully down rabbit holes where I'm already suffering from a theoretical worst case scenario. And then I think having gone through some really bad times in my life, like a couple of divorces and, lawsuits and all these sorts of things, situations where like I had these like ideas of the worst case scenarios and then all the worst case scenarios happened. And then I got through them and was like, oh, I didn't die. And I felt like my life fell apart, but it's a year past it and I'm back. And so I think that kind of, you realize like, hey, if you're not dead, you can still be okay. And it doesn't mean that I don't have times where I get spun up or whatever, but just learning how to talk myself through those moments of high stress, man, that's made a huge difference, especially like on my pain level. And there's a lot of research data on this, that your physical pain is very much tied to how psychologically stressed you become. And that's made a huge, huge difference on my performance.
Speaking about your performance, what are you doing in the gym? You said you're there for like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
Your goal is about to be as strong as possible because you're competing in strongman.
In powerlifting, yeah. So I compete squat, bench press, deadlift. I'm an old guy now. I'm 43, going to be 44 in December. So I compete in the Masters 1 category. But in that category, I won Worlds in 2022 and 2024, and I've won 2 Open national titles, which any age division, and then 3 Masters titles and for nationals as well. So yeah, I love powerlifting. It's fun. I love picking heavy stuff up, putting heavy stuff on my back. But there is a lot of my working sets on squats, are going to be in the high 500s, low 600s. And so it takes me a while to do enough warm up sets to get tuned up for that.
Yeah.
And then in deadlifts, I'm working out in the mid 6s, low 7s, for sets. And, again, it takes a long time to kind of do that. And I think the thing that people don't realize about powerlifting that's really difficult is just how psychologically and emotionally locked in you have to be. Because if you there's been times where I just had a brain fart, in a squat, and it's 100 pounds less than I should max out on. And I just get down the hole and go, nope. And I just dump it, I just wasn't focused. And so that level of razor focus to move as much weight as possible, I have to rest a long time between sets just to kind of psychologically recover and then be able to get myself focused again for the next set. So yeah, those sessions do take a while. But usually around 2 hours, now.
How has your strength changed over the years? Would you say you're the strongest you've ever been?
Close to it. A deadlift for sure. Probably the strongest my deadlift has ever been. My squat still has a little ways to go. My best squat ever was 668. And right now I could probably do, if I was peaked, I could probably do 630 or 640. Bench press is still lagging a little bit behind my best. My best was 391 in competition, probably around 370 right now, maybe 375. So I don't think age really impacted it that much. I went through a series of back and hip injuries and a lot of pain over a 7-year period that I kind of had to work through. And really, again, the game changer was evidence-based pain management and psychological stress management was really where I started getting healthy again. And I would say for the most part, when I'm able to consistently train the way I know I can train, I'm pretty much as strong as I've ever been.
Have you needed to do any other exercises to help with performing those lifts? Or is it just a matter of, okay, I want to be the best I could possibly be at squats, bench press, deadlift? Is it just repeat practice? Or are there some cases where maybe you need to work on glute strength, or maybe you need to strengthen lower back in order to help you with the overall performance of doing those big lifts?
Straight down the line scientific answer is if you want to be better at squatting, do more squats. What I will say is the squats and the main lifts can be very fatiguing, not just physically, but also emotionally and psychologically. And the reason for that is one of the mind fucks of powerlifting is what your best is every single time you go in the gym. And you are always, even if you try not to, you're always comparing it.
Yeah.
So when you're going to do a main lift, it's hard not to have certain level of nerves and anxiety about it, even in a normal training session. And so that's where I think, doing some variations where, tempo squats or pause deadlifts, I don't think those are necessarily going to make you stronger per se compared to the main lift, but it gives you a psychological break from grinding out the main lifts over and over. And there are situations, for example, if I'm dealing with an injury or I've got some aggravation on a certain lift, I can do a variation a lot of times that will help. I mean, in 2022, man, I was still dealing with a lot of pain in my hip and lower back that would flare up quite often. And I mean, I basically did like one heavy set of squats per week and one heavy set of deadlifts per week leading into Worlds. And I just did a crap load of belt squats and RDLs. And that was good enough to help me win Worlds in 2022. Now, doing those belt squats, was it as good as doing the same number of sets on regular squats? I doubt it. But if I was able to do that with a lot of intensity, because I didn't have pain in my lower back doing that, it was still better than me trying to gut out, straight sets of squats. So the answer to your question is, the research would say if you want to get better at a lift, just do more of the lift. But I think from a practical perspective, there are limits to that. And you probably want to incorporate some kind of variety.
What does the research say in terms of deloading or recovery? Like, that's of the aspect which you just described. Is it a 4-6 weeks, or you continue? How would you approach that? Maybe not on your level, but the people who are trying to get as jacked as possible.
Well, you say what loading?
In terms of deloading weeks, recovery weeks, how do you structure, especially because you just mentioned when you're trying to build up, but your body might need time to recover?
So yeah, and that's the thing with strength is you can be very strong, and short term it can be masked by under recovery. I mean, this is like when I'm getting ready for a meet, usually the last, we try to build like a base level of strength in the quote unquote off season. And then we push the gas doing a lot of really heavy lifts leading into the meet. And my fitness, the lift that I'm getting better at, my fitness is going up, but also my fatigue is going up. So a lot of times, I can remember one year before nationals, I was so frigging fatigued. I just felt like everything was so painfully slow and grindy. I was warming up on deadlifts and I was supposed to hit like, I don't know, high sixes that day for a single. I got to 585, which was my last warm up, and I barely moved it off the ground. And I was like, my God. And I ended up like getting myself real fired up, and I got a single rep of 585, like grinded it out. A week later, or not a week, about 9 days later, I hit 716 at nationals, like, and smoked it, and it just goes to show, like, as Vince Lombardi said, fatigue makes cowards of us all. And fatigue really can mask your strength. So when it comes to deloads, I don't so much worry about if my performance starts dropping. I more worry about if it starts dropping so much and I feel so bad and so fatigued that I'm probably getting to the point where I'm risking some acute injury because I'm so under recovered, right? And if we look at like the best prediction of injury risk is overall recovery status. Or if you're making like a massive jump in volume or intensity really quickly, that can predict injury. So usually the way I do deloads or tapers is, at this point, I kind of know how frequently I'll need them just from history and based on progression. But that can change based on life circumstance. I might need more frequent if I'm going through a really stressful life period or getting less sleep. I might need less of them if things are going very smoothly. So what I usually do is I kind of see how things are going. If I have a week where things are depressed, I usually won't necessarily just do a taper the next week. Sometimes it's like, okay, performance dips, but I use less weight because performance is dipping, and then I recover, and then the next week I have a really good week, right? And so my weeks tend to be like that. They tend to kind of undulate a little bit. And usually I'm looking for, okay, it's been a couple weeks now of kind of a consistent decline. Now it's probably time to like give myself a little bit more recovery. And usually what I'll do is I'll just cut volume down, and I'll cut intensity back a little bit as well. And 1 or 2 weeks of that is usually sufficient to kind of get me there. But I would tell people, like, you can plan taper weeks, but I usually don't take them unless I'm like, okay, this has been a couple weeks now. It's probably time to give myself some recovery catch up.
So the takeaway is you listen to your body more. It's not like every 6 weeks to take a week off.
Right.
Final question. And when we prepared that question, given your approach to things and science-backed approach, and let's test it first before implementing it, I am actually very, very interested how you're going to reply to that. One of the biggest trends around health optimization in the last months, feels like maybe even a couple of years already, has been the word peptides. And everybody's trying to implement them as part of their stack, on top of their supplements, on top of the essentials that you mentioned.
Right.
And including high-performing athletes and bodybuilders. What is your personal take on that? And if we take that with the honesty serum approach in parallel to your researcher approach.
You cut out for a little bit, said supplement stack.
I said on top of your supplement stack. We know your basics that you cover, the supplement stack. How does peptides potentially play into that as an add-on?
Okay. So I don't know hardly anything about peptides. What I will say, and my girl is actually an expert in this. She works at a longevity clinic. She's a nurse practitioner. Basically, I'm not an expert. I know very little. My impression from what I've talked to her about is there does appear to be some that have some benefits, especially anecdotally from people. There's very few research studies on these. But there's a lot of moving pieces with like FDA regulation, whether they're legal or not legal, or they can be prescribed or not. What I will tell people is if somebody's trying to sell you like a supplement, like a pill that's a peptide, it's a scam, because peptides are proteins, and proteins get broken down with basic digestion. So it's going to be some form of like an injection if you're doing a peptide that's legit. But I don't really know enough about that world. I know some people swear by them, especially for recovery and injury recovery and whatnot. I've never tried any, and I just don't know that much about it. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, at the end of the day, like GLP-1 is a peptide, and those are really helping out a lot of people. So I think it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen with this with these technologies.
And the stigma is shifting from the appetite suppressing to insulin sensitivity improvement and metabolism improvements. So it's been interesting. And again, our perspective was that somebody with your background, the science-backed, is probably very, very cautious of this aspect. But I had to ask, because everybody else is asking us what are the approaches, what the experts are saying. Dr. Layne Norton, thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. Mike and I were looking for that. Lots of things learned. Lots of things that we're going to implement. Can you please share with the audience where you can find more about you and projects you're working on?
Yeah, so you can find more about me on my website, biolayne.com, and I'm BioLayne on pretty much all social media. I would say my biggest following is on Instagram and then YouTube, but I'm on X, TikTok, all those places. And projects I'm working on. I just started my own podcast a couple months ago, which I'm really excited about. It's called the Dr. Layne Norton Podcast. And I also am I don't want to count my chickens for the hatch, but I should sign my first deal for a published book today, actually, right after this call. So
nice.
Going to be writing a book about muscle gain, the benefits of building muscle, the health benefits, and kind of a systematic way of doing it. And I'm very excited for that because the publishing team behind me is excellent, and they are very excited about it. So I think it's going to be a really cool project for me.
Awesome. Can't wait to read it.
Yes. And next time I'm in Florida, I'm going to hit you up.
Sounds great.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time.